He will talk a little bit about his company and particularly how they use the networking and mobile broadband going forward. And Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jacob Novak. I'm Director of Business Development for Square Enix Holdings. And I'm going to speak a little bit about how the network has affected my industry and how I think that my industry is going to affect the network in the future. So first, a little bit about my company, Square Enix. You may not know our name necessarily, but you probably know our brands and our games. Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Space Invaders, Tomb Raider, Hitman. We are one of the largest video game publishers in the world. We are active not only in the console space, in the mobile space, in the social space, browser, PC games, you name it, we're there. We make movies, we make comic books, we make toys. We're all over. We are headquartered in Japan, but we have studios around the world. But I'm going to focus today more on my industry than I am on my specific company. And I want to start off the discussion by talking a little bit about games, because you may not think of it this way, but games are in fact the ultimate application. Look at what's happening on the screen right now. Look at the water effects, look at the reflections, look at the textures. The vehicles, the people that are moving, the AI that powers that, the textures that are going into that, the millions upon millions of polygons that are on the screen, all of that calculated within milliseconds. That takes tremendous processing power. And the latency that's required to do that, the technology that's required to do that appropriately, is likewise something that's very intense and difficult to do, both on the software side and on the hardware side. But first, let's talk about what everybody's interested in, which is what is the business size. We are an over $70 million business right now worldwide. And what was the majority of our business about 15 years ago, retail hardware and retail software, is now much smaller pieces of pie. We have games that are leading on mobile, tablet, PC, and digital distribution, MMOs, which are massive online multiplayer games, of course social games, web games, and connected game consoles. So the industry overall is very diversified, and over the last 15 years has really been propelled by the network. They're interactive media, and this is a key point for me. When you download a Lady Gaga song, it's the same one you hear on the radio, it's the same one you hear on Pandora. Right? That song never changes. When you see Jurassic Park in the movie theater, it's the same version that you'll see on DVD, it's the same version that you'll see on Blu-ray, it's the same version that you'll see on Netflix. But every time you play a game, it's always different. Every single scene that we render, every frame, is always different. The calculation is different, and we require input from the player. So we can't simply pause, rewind, fast forward. We need to take in all of that input from the player within milliseconds in order to be able to create that frame that I just spoke about. Because of all this, games are in fact the most demanding consumer software used these days. That's why every single time there's a major technology event, for example, Apple releases a new iPhone, they always drag a game company on stage to show off the processor, because a browser, a word processor, its processing needs are only a certain limited amount. So of your processor, what shows it off better than the processing power that's required for games? That's why people spend hundreds upon hundreds of dollars for a little black box that sits under the television that only plays games. So these days it's diversified into media in other forms of connected services. And of course, that's why people spend thousands upon thousands of dollars for custom PCs that include amazing graphics cards for the purpose of playing games. So, what's happened to games? What's happened to the industry? We've been transformed by the network, and I really love this picture. This is the Staples Center in Los Angeles. Right? This is the World Championship for League of Legends, which is one of the biggest online games in the world right now. These people piled into the Staples Center not to watch the Lakers play, but to watch two teams compete in an online game. Right? That is the extent to which the network has transformed our industry. So what it used to be was that hardware drove innovation for us. So games are very complex, right? It takes a lot of calculating power in order to be able to make them. So complex that when the game industry started, the vast majority of games could only be played on specialized hardware. We call that an arcade machine. right? So you had to make the motherboard and the system and the overall frame, everything from scratch, and it was only for a single game. Now, as hardware got cheaper and more powerful, we were able to create consoles, right? Hardware which could play many different types of games, but which are still specialized for the game. And as that technology improved, games were innovated. So you went from Space Invaders to Super Mario Bros. Now, as technology improved further, and you had the creation of the CD-ROM, you could create even further, more immersive experiences. So you had computer-generated movies and 3D games. When my company, Square, released Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation, we created a revolution in the way that 3D games and interaction were taking place. And then finally, by the early 2000s, you had game consoles already starting to become general media devices. So many people's first DVD player was the PlayStation 2. And as you got more processing power, you got more open worlds. And as this innovation grew, so did our industry. So we started from zero, and over the course of about 30 years, we grew to a $30 billion industry. But what happens, starting from the early 2000s, is that hardware starts to lose its driving power for innovation and gets taken over by the network. And it's the network that starts to drive everything from my industry. You start to see consoles connected to the net and all the new types of games that come from that. You get smartphones in people's pockets, right? Every single game you play on a smartphone, you download it digitally, probably is connected to a backend that's logging your stats, has some sort of business model that's dealing with microtransactions, and of course browser games and tablets. Many of the games that are the biggest sellers these days don't necessarily look better than games that came out 15 years ago. It's not graphical power that's driving the business these days, right? The reason we went from a $30 billion to a $60 billion and this year to a $70 billion industry is thanks to the power of the network and what it's brought to games. So to repeat myself, better hardware brought us sustainable innovation, right? If you look at the graphical power that has come from the consoles, the games look a lot better. But the network brings disruption, okay? So it's thanks to the network we have multiplayer games. You have games like Activision's Call of Duty, which is a $1 billion franchise. You have MMOs like our Final Fantasy XIV, which is an awesome game that just came out recently. Please definitely go play it. You have multi-online battle arena games like League of Legends that I just mentioned. You have social games like Farmville, like Puzzle and Dragon, all the popular games that DNA remake in Japan. You have mobile games. This is Google's Ingress game, which is a really awesome game where you can go to different places around the world and see the alternate reality that's going on there and fight with a different team. And of course, you have Minecraft, which is this big phenomenon game that grew virally from being digitally distributed, online connected. And it's not that the graphics are better at that, right? This really popular game is not being driven from its graphical quality, which is quite, an old aesthetic. It's being driven from the fact that the network is there. So the network disrupted our game design. The network disrupted our business models. We went from being an industry where every single thing was a $60 package product, right? And so when you have a packaged product, you have a willingness to pay problem. A lot of people are not willing to pay $60 for a game. They may be willing to pay $30. A lot more people are willing to pay $200 for a game, and you're missing out on that money. When you have the microtransaction model, you enable people to be able to pay what they want to pay. And as a result, you unlock significant business value. And the only way you can do that model is by having your product connected to the network. You have the subscription model, which is driven in World of Warcraft and many of the popular online service games. You have advertisements, which is still a small portion of the business right now, but which I believe will grow more in the future. And of course, you have digital pricing, which is very significant, right? The way that we used to price our products, we would have to decide the product price way in advance. We would sell it to the retailer, and a lot of that would be left up to them. Now we can control the price directly on the fly, see what the consumer trends are, and adjust it up or down as we need to, and make sure that we maximize our revenue. That's all thanks to the network. And the final disruption, of course, comes to marketing. We have the free-to-play model, which is a marketing model, it's not a business model. And it allows us to put our products out there without any barrier to entry to the consumers so they can try it. And this is how DNA grew to be some of the biggest companies for gaming in the world right now. And of course, connected to that is the cross-promotional network. So now I can take my product and it's not just a one-off relationship with my consumers, but I can then go and recommend them other products of mine, other products within my network. And of course you have the App Store. So this is a very different form of marketing than what we were limited to before. We used to be limited to a poster at a video game store, maybe a stand-up, an advertisement in a magazine or a billboard. But now we have so many different ways to advertise our product and be connected directly to the consumer that we didn't have before. But as much as the network has affected our industry's effect on the network has been limited. And that is because, as I said, the latency requirements for games is so strict that to the extent possible, we have tried not to rely on the network. We do all of our processing locally on the client. We do all of our input locally on the client. And to the extent that we can, we make the data that we send to the data center very limited, because every little packet delay, every little packet drop is going to affect the latency that our consumer sees, and they're very, very sensitive to that. But that's going to change. My belief is that games will transform the network. And we'll start talking about this from the perspective of video. Videos already have a drastic effect on the network. Okay? If you look at what is driving the network in the United States right now, it's Netflix consumption, YouTube consumption, in Japan it's Nico consumption. And the answer for the network industry to this has been the creation of things like CDNs, right? You've created solutions, you've implemented solutions, you've built networks around solutions to drive passive media to consumers, and it's redefined the global network. But interactive media, not passive media, is the next revolution of the network, and it's already started. It's already begun. Sony acquired Gaikai last year, a cloud gaming company, for $400 million. They're making significant investments in networks, over-the-top internet to play games. Right? Microsoft is putting in $700 million for cloud services. And these are just two of many different cloud gaming components that are coming in the next few years. I'm not sure how the start of this will be, but I guarantee you that this is where it has to go, because it is inevitable that rendering, the creation of that image, that processing, right, that taking of the input from the player and making an image and streaming it back to them in real time will shift to the data center. It has to go there because it doesn't make sense for it not to go there. From an efficiency perspective, I have so much power between my smartphones and my game consoles and everything else out there, and it's being wasted. Right? It's much more efficient for it to go to the data center, where the overall cost for the ecosystem can go down, and we can start to leverage the power of scalability to create new experiences for our customers. And so this is where gaming will go. It may not be today, it may not be next year, but within the next 10 years, I guarantee, we will have to go there, and more of games will shift their processing and their rendering to the data center. But we've reached a tipping point for interactive media. The way the network is set up right now, we can't go much further as an industry. The networks today are they're not ready for it, right? You can't cache a game. It's impossible, right? Everything has to be calculated at that millisecond level on the clock. So you can't use a CDN for games. They require extremely low latency. We've heard 20 millisecond latency for automated cars. We're near that. We need round-trip latency. That's not one way, that's round-trip latency of 30 milliseconds to 40 milliseconds, right, at the maximum. We're nearing, high-density trading levels of latency that we need, and the consumer demand is going to be there because new forms of games are coming, right? We've got this Oculus Rift system. It's very cool. It's virtual reality. Now you have to render two screens, right, for a single person, because that's the way you create the virtual image. That's a lot of processing power, right? And as games get better, to have to render two screens on the fly for a single person is going to require a lot of things. We've got 4K televisions coming out, and eventually 8K televisions. And once you start to reach that level of resolution, plus the resolution that our games are at, you start to reach physical limits of what a processor can do if it's by itself. And therefore, in order to be able to render these games 10 years from now in 8K, we're going to have to scale it across lots of processors in a data center. It's impossible otherwise. And then, of course, you've got wearable computing. I mean, I've been using Google Glass for a couple months now. It's really, really awesome. But it is the quintessential cloud computing device. This is the way cloud computing is going to sneak into everybody's everyday lives, because you don't realize that almost none of the processing occurs here. When you start to combine this with games, and it's going to happen, right? Interactive media on these wearable devices, you need the data center to process everything. So it may not happen today, but in the coming decade, this is where it will go, I guarantee it. And I also can guarantee that those who invest in this, those who make the early moves into it, are going to lead to significant profits, to engagement with their users and their customers, and data, right? Because right now, the data that's coming from the gamers is only going to us, but once you start to put it into the telecom and the other networks in there, there's a lot more behavior analytics to share. So what I want to get across today is that we need a new vision for the network. Because the global networks that we have right now are going to be strained by the future demand that's going to come from this, because again, you can't cache it, and all of the interactive media that's going to come in the future without the right solution in place. We're thinking about this, we're actively researching on this topic, we're speaking to a lot of companies, anybody else who wants to think about this more and learn with us, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak about it with you today. Let's talk. Thank you very much.
Well done. All right, our next speaker.